The air in the Tower of London hung thick with terror, a stench so potent that even the battle-hardened guards felt their stomachs churn. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, knelt on a scaffold built just for her, an altar to royal desperation. She was about to become the first English queen in history to face the executioner's blade. But what if I told you that moment wasn't just a brutal end to an inconvenient marriage? It was a meticulously orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare, a 17-day descent into hell that would forever scar her daughter, Elizabeth, and reshape the destiny of an entire nation. We're about to peel back the layers of history, drawing directly from eyewitness accounts, including the chilling letters of the Tower Constable himself. These are details so disturbing, so meticulously cruel, they were actively suppressed for centuries. Get ready to witness the systematic destruction of a woman, a process that went far beyond the swift swing of a French executioner's sword. Picture this. May 2nd, 1536. Anne Boleyn is at the peak of her power, watching a vibrant jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. From the royal box, Queen Anne drops her handkerchief, a time-honored gesture of favor, to a knight below. King Henry VIII, seated beside her, witnesses this innocent act. And something snaps. He storms out. Within 24 hours, Anne is arrested. The charges? Adultery, incest, high treason. But here's where the story takes a truly sinister turn. Henry had already signed Anne's death warrant before any investigation even began. This wasn't a fit of rage. It was cold, calculated, and absolutely premeditated. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's ruthless chief minister, constructed a case so outrageous that even Anne's bitterest enemies questioned it. The accusation? She had slept with 5 men, including her own brother, George. Think about that. Incest. A charge designed not to prove guilt, but to ensure execution. The evidence? A court musician named Mark Smeaton. His confession was extracted after 24 agonizing hours on the rack. The other 4 men, including Anne's brother, held firm, maintaining their innocence even as they faced their own executions. They knew it was a lie, but under torture 1 man broke. And that was all Henry needed. They didn't even bother making the lies believable. The indictments claimed Anne committed adultery on specific dates when royal records prove she was in completely different locations. For example, they accused her of an affair at Greenwich on May 13, 1535. Yet court documents show she was actually at Richmond Palace, over 10 miles away. It was a glaring, almost arrogant disregard for the truth, because they knew it didn't matter. The verdict was sealed. Even Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador, a man who despised Anne Boleyn with every fiber of his being, wrote to Emperor Charles V, stating the charges were based on presumption and certain indications without valid proof or confession. When your fiercest enemy admits you're being framed, you know something is profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. This wasn't some impulsive outburst. Just 8 days before Anne's arrest, Henry signed a commission granting Cromwell unlimited power to investigate and prosecute anyone at court. Cromwell later bragged that he had been authorized and commissioned by the king to prosecute and bring to an end the mistress's trial. Bring to an end. Not investigate, not seek justice, not determine guilt or innocence. Just end it. Quick favor. If this deep dive into Tudor England is revealing information you've never heard before, hit that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the truly dark and suppressed truths behind history's most iconic figures, and I'm building an entire series on these Tudor conspiracies you won't want to miss. Now, let me tell you about the psychological torture that began the moment Anne entered the tower. They didn't throw her into a dank dungeon. No, they did something far more twisted. They locked her in the exact same luxurious apartments where she had stayed just 3 years earlier, preparing for her coronation. Imagine being surrounded by the very tapestries, the same furniture, the same views where you once dreamed of becoming queen. Now you're preparing to die. Sir William Kingston, the Tower Constable, meticulously documented everything in letters that have survived. When Anne arrived, she asked, "Master Kingston, shall I go into a dungeon?" He replied, "No, madam, you shall go into the lodging you lay in at your coronation." Kingston wrote, "At this, she fell into a great laughing, as she has done many times since." That wasn't joy. That was a woman's mind beginning to fracture under impossible, suffocating stress. The psychological warfare intensified with total surveillance. Every single word Anne spoke was recorded. Her 4 ladies-in-waiting were actually spies, including Lady Kingston, the constable's own wife. These women reported everything. Anne's dreams, her prayers, her desperate attempts to understand what was happening. She would pace her rooms, alternating between hysterical laughter and uncontrollable sobbing. At one point, Anne told Kingston, "I hear say that I should be accused with 3 men, and I can say no more but nay, without I should open my body." She was literally offering to undergo a physical examination to prove her innocence. That's how desperate she'd become, willing to endure ultimate humiliation just for a chance at justice. But the cruelest torture was the manipulation of hope. They kept delaying her execution date, forcing her to prepare for death multiple times. Originally scheduled for May 18th, they postponed it to May 19th without explanation. Anne had spent the entire night of the 17th praying, preparing her soul, saying goodbye in her mind. Then sunrise came and nothing. Kingston reported she seemed very desirous to be executed by that point. They had broken her so completely that death had become a mercy. Throughout those 17 days in the Tower, Anne kept asking about her sweet brother, George, and her father. She couldn't comprehend that George was in the Tower too, awaiting his own execution. Or that her father, Thomas Boleyn, had abandoned her completely to save himself. No family member tried to defend her. No friend spoke up. She was utterly alone, surrounded by enemies and spies, waiting to die. The trial itself on May 15th was pure theater. But here's what will truly shock you. On the morning of Anne's trial, before it even began, Henry told Jane Seymour that Anne would be condemned that very day. He was already planning their wedding while his wife was on trial for her life. The jury wasn't just biased, it was systematically packed with Anne's enemies. 27 peers sat in judgment, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided over the proceedings. "Yes, you heard that right," her uncle pronounced her death sentence. The jury included Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who had openly called Anne a goggled whore. It included Henry Percy, Anne's former lover whom she'd been forced to abandon years earlier. It included multiple relatives of Jane Seymour, the woman who would replace Anne as queen just 11 days after the execution. They might as well have carved guilty on the courtroom walls before she even walked in. Anne received no legal counsel. She wasn't told the specific charges until she stood before the court. She had no opportunity to call witnesses in her defense. The prosecution presented no physical evidence and called no live witnesses. The entire case rested on written depositions and hearsay. Yet, when her uncle asked for the verdict, all 27 peers declared her guilty. Every single one. Now, here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The method of execution became another form of psychological torture. Burning was the traditional punishment for adultery and treason by a queen. But Henry, in what he presented as an act of mercy, commuted this to beheading. Except there was a catch. He insisted on bringing in a special executioner from France, an expert swordsman from Calais. This meant more delays, more psychological agony, as Anne waited for her specially imported executioner to arrive. Why a French swordsman? On the surface, it seemed merciful. Death by sword was quicker and cleaner than the axe. But I believe Henry had another, more insidious motive. Using a French executioner sent a message. Anne was so utterly outside English law, so beyond redemption, that even her execution required foreign hands. It was one final humiliation, one last way to mark her as other, as not truly English, despite being queen. The execution morning itself, May 19th, revealed Anne's complete psychological transformation. Witnesses described her as almost ethereal, dressed in a gray damask gown trimmed with ermine, her hair tucked under a simple cap. The woman who had once blazed through court like a dark star was now pale, composed, almost translucent. She had moved beyond fear into a strange state of acceptance that unnerved everyone present. On the scaffold, Anne gave a speech that historians still debate. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord and asked people to pray for him. Some see this as Stockholm Syndrome. Others, a desperate attempt to protect her daughter, Elizabeth. But listen to her exact words. "I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler or a more merciful prince was there never. And to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." The sarcasm is so thick you could cut it with that French sword. But then came the moment that truly haunts me. Anne turned to her ladies and said, "I hear the executioner is very good, and I have a little neck." She put her hands around her throat and laughed. "That's not gallows humor. That's a woman who has been so thoroughly broken, so psychologically annihilated, that she's making jokes about her own beheading." The crowd fell completely silent. The French executioner was indeed skilled. As Anne knelt upright, French style, not bent over a block, she kept looking around, waiting for the blow. The executioner had hidden his sword under the straw bois. While Anne was momentarily distracted by his assistant, he struck. One clean cut. Witnesses said her lips continued moving in prayer for several minutes after her head was severed. Whether that was remaining consciousness or just muscle contractions, we'll never know. But that image of Anne's lips, still moving in prayer after death, burned itself into the collective memory of everyone present. Here's the part that truly shows the utter cruelty of it all. They hadn't even prepared a proper coffin. Anne's sobbing ladies had to wrap her head and body in white cloth and place them in an old arrow chest they found in the Tower Armory. The first Queen of England to be executed was buried in a box meant for weapons, dumped in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula. No funeral, no prayers, no marker. As if she had never existed. But the horror didn't end with Anne's death. Let me tell you what this did to her daughter. Elizabeth was just 2 years old when her mother was executed. At 8, after watching her stepmother Catherine Howard meet the same fate on the same spot, Elizabeth declared, "I will never marry." She kept that vow for the rest of her life. The Virgin Queen's refusal to marry, which defined her entire reign, was born in the shadow of that scaffold. Elizabeth could never publicly acknowledge her mother. Anne had been declared a traitor and an adulteress. But in private, she wore a ring her entire adult life that contained hidden portraits of herself and Anne Boleyn, positioned face to face. When the ring was finally removed from her finger after death, courtiers discovered this secret she'd carried for decades. She also kept her mother's book of hours, her jewelry, even displayed Anne's falcon badge in her palaces when she thought no one would notice. But here's what truly reveals the psychological damage: Elizabeth's relationship with execution itself. Unlike her father, who killed at will, unlike her sister Mary, who burned hundreds, Elizabeth agonized over every death warrant. When Parliament demanded Mary, Queen of Scots' execution, Elizabeth delayed for months. After finally signing the warrant, she claimed her advisors had tricked her. Some historians call this political theater. But I see a woman haunted by her mother's ghost, terrified of becoming the monster her father was. The execution of Anne Boleyn did more than remove an inconvenient queen. It fundamentally broke the English understanding of justice. Here was proof that the law meant nothing if you displeased the king. Evidence could be fabricated, juries could be packed, even the sacred bond of marriage, blessed by God, could be destroyed by royal whim. If the queen herself could be subjected to judicial murder, what hope did anyone else have? This precedent claimed its next victim just 6 years later. Catherine Howard, Anne's young cousin, was executed on the same Tower Green, on charges just as fabricated. The machinery of royal destruction that killed Anne Boleyn had become a well-oiled system. By then, people knew the script: arrest, imprisonment in the Tower, packed jury, predetermined verdict, execution. The only variable was the method. Catherine got the axe instead of the sword. But I haven't told you the worst part yet. Remember Mark Smeaton, the musician whose tortured confession started this whole nightmare? He was the only one of the accused men who confessed, and he was the only one from a common background. The four gentlemen, including George Boleyn, maintained their innocence to the end and died with noble dignity. But Smeaton, he disappeared into historical silence after his confession, executed without fanfare, his family destroyed, his name forever linked with lies extracted by torture. Those 17 days in May 1536 revealed the true horror of Tudor power. Not the public executions meant to terrify. Those were theater everyone understood. The real horror was the systematic perversion of justice, the psychological destruction of the victim, the participation of family members in judicial murder. Anne's own uncle pronounced her death sentence. Her father didn't lift a finger to save her. The entire English establishment collaborated in killing a woman they knew was innocent. International reaction was immediate and damning. The French were so appalled that Lancelot de Carles, secretary to their ambassador, wrote a 1318-line poem about Anne's execution within 2 weeks. Henry was so disturbed by this account spreading through Europe that he ordered his ambassador in Paris to suppress it. Even in an age of brutal politics, Europe was shocked that a king would execute his queen on such obviously fabricated charges. The Spanish ambassador, Chapuis, despite loathing Anne, wrote to Emperor Charles V that people were murmuring about the proceedings. That's diplomatic speak for. Everyone knows this was murder. Foreign courts began to reconsider their dealings with a king who could kill his wife so easily. The execution damaged England's reputation across Europe, marking Henry VIII as dangerously unstable. But perhaps the most chilling aspect is how quickly it all happened. 17 days from accusation to execution. 17 days to destroy a woman who had been Queen of England, who had worn the crown, who had been anointed with holy oil in Westminster Abbey. The speed wasn't just about efficiency. It was designed to prevent any organized defense, any second thoughts, any intervention from those who might have helped her. Modern historians have proven beyond doubt that Anne was innocent. The dates don't match. The accusers were tortured or coerced. The jury was packed. The evidence was fabricated. Even at the time, nobody really believed the charges. But that wasn't the point. The point was to demonstrate that Henry VIII's will was absolute, that marriage meant nothing, that even queens could be destroyed when they became inconvenient. Anne Boleyn's execution stands as one of history's starkest examples of judicial murder. But it also, in a twisted way, created England's greatest monarch. Elizabeth's legendary 45-year reign, her defeat of the Spanish Armada, her transformation of England into a major power. All of it was shaped by the trauma of her mother's death. The Virgin Queen, who refused to marry, who ruled with calculated brilliance, who turned England into a maritime empire, was forged in the horror of May 19, 1536. Would Elizabeth have become such an extraordinary ruler without that childhood trauma? Would she have developed that steel spine, that uncanny ability to survive in a world of male power, without the brutal example of her mother's destruction? We'll never know. But we do know this: Anne Boleyn's death created the very thing Henry VIII feared most. A daughter who would surpass him in every way, who would rule longer, more successfully, and be remembered far more fondly than the king who killed her mother. The Tower of London still stands, of course. Tourists walk through those same rooms where Anne spent her final days, take photos on Tower Green where the scaffold stood. There's a glass memorial there now, listing all who died on that spot. But you can't capture the horror in tourist attractions. You can't convey the systematic destruction of a human being, the perversion of justice, the collaboration of an entire system in judicial murder. What happened to Anne Boleyn could happen to anyone when power decides law doesn't matter. When evidence can be fabricated, When juries can be packed, when the verdict is decided before the trial begins, justice dies just as surely as the victim on the scaffold. That's the real horror of Anne Boleyn's execution. Not just that an innocent woman died, but that an entire nation watched it happen and did nothing. Every time we accept injustice because it doesn't affect us directly, every time we watch power corrupt justice and stay silent, we participate in the same horror that killed Anne Boleyn. Her ghost doesn't haunt the Tower of London. It haunts every courtroom where verdict comes before evidence, every system where power matters more than truth. The French executioner was paid £23 for his work, about £8,000 in today's money. That's what it cost to kill a Queen of England. But the real price was paid by English justice, by every person who lived in fear of royal power, by a small girl named Elizabeth who grew up knowing her mother's fate. That price, England is still paying. If this hidden history of Tudor horror fascinated you, watch this next video where I reveal the dark truth about Henry VIII's medical condition that drove him to murder. You'll discover how a jousting accident transformed England's golden prince into history's most notorious wife killer. Subscribe for more suppressed historical truths, and I'll see you in the next investigation.